Betty Grimes and the Thermadore Thief, a story based in the wizarding world of Harry Potter. Chapter 1. Perfissiphus. Every day at 6:30, for a brief moment, he saw it. Mounted on his horse, the rancher checked his watch and waited for them to come. 6:45. A large stampede of horses galloped just above the hill on the neighbouring property and rode east. There it was, surrounded by the herd. His eyes weren't deceiving him. His family wasn't convinced, calling him delirious. He assured them he had been taking his medication and his glasses were recently renewed. The ranch across theirs belonged to an old couple, the Grimes. For 14 years they resided there. He still remembered when they first arrived, when they had very distinctive blonde hair, but when he sees them pass by in their large black vehicle, silver lines their heads, though still well kept. They didn't seem like the farmer type, dressed so proper and elegant. Perhaps they bought the old ranch as a home. It was a mid-August evening, the sky turning a yellow tinge. He glimpsed at his watch. 6:30. He was there, on his horse with his cattle, up north in his property. Then they came, 100 horses prancing down the hill across the fence. There were the usual browns, greys, blacks and leopard spots. There it was again. Its white reflective coat gleamed amidst the mangled cloud of the other colours. Its silky white hair flowed so gracefully and freely like his wife's did so many years ago. But it was that golden rod protruding out its head that baffled him the most. What the rancher didn't know was that he secured a daily glimpse so few of his kind will ever see, a world hidden within his own. The Grimes were not merely mysterious neighbours, but of that world. A world where humans wielded extraordinary abilities and things like taboos, spells, curses and charms thrived, unbounded by the laws of no-mage science. They were on the upper echelon of that world, having gained immense wealth the past 100 years. They were an exemplary American wizarding family, and they were neighbours. The rancher stared after them, mesmerised as the herd headed east and up the hill to depart him for the day. The horses galloped, heading north deeper into the Grimes property where they encountered more hills. They eventually reached a small pond close to the stables, huddling around the oblong small body of water, quenching. Not far from the pond sat a girl on a chair, leaned over a table behind a fence line. She was much closer than the rancher, gazing not amusedly like he did, but more so irritatedly. She scanned for the creature, past the less interesting browns, greys and blacks. There it was, its mouth now dipped part way into the water. She then stared at her watch, 7:15. "Why are you guys late?" she yelled at the herd. Though she was familiar with talking animals, these ones didn't talk back. They've never been this late so far, and why on the last day of the family reunion? The white creature then rose its head with water dripping down its white snout, trotted around the pond and made its way towards her. "Perfissiphus, you're late," the observer snapped before drenching her quill in ink. She started with 4 hooves on the parchment below, then traced 8 lines up, defining the ergot, cannon and the knee. The creature neighed. "Stop moving!" she yelled. "Do you want this portrait to look bad?" The white creature obliged, standing proud against the wind that blew its silky white hair to the east. The observer then traced the elbow, gaskin and strife before starting on the belly. The creature looked magnificent in the wind, if only her curly blonde locks didn't block her view. But just as she adjusted her hair back, the creature suddenly trotted away into the nearby field. "Really, Perfissiphus!" she yelled. With her arms wrapped to the parchment bound by a leather base, she leaped off her chair and scampered down the path off the barbed wire fence, following after the horse-like creature. "Don't move this time!" she yelled. The 2 pieces of furniture then twitched to life and ran after her like command dogs. Once they reached her, the chair leaned down on its 2 front legs to allow the observer to quickly sit. It lifted effortlessly and pulled forward, facing the table that stopped next to the fence. She then captured the elbow, back, hip, dock, and tail. "Move your head, Perfissiphus!" The creature didn't obey. The observer sighed. She didn't want to use another horse as reference. Nearly all of them had necks and heads that looked too rigid to her liking. She scanned into the herd once again, hoping to find a look-alike. A red dun foal not far from the fence to her right looked close enough. She finalised with lines streaking up, forming the cress, pole, muzzle and snout. Now for the final piece, the alicorn. The observer, with another dip with her quill, lightly traced 2 straight lines between the eyes of the horse, connecting them once she felt the lengths were right. She then looked up. To her disappointment, Perfissiphus's head was now up, posing for her like he did not a minute before. "I really don't like you," she groaned. The observer then dropped from the chair and examined her work. This portrait was her best one yet, and it only took a couple of minutes. She scanned and scanned again, comparing it to the real-life counterpart. The more she stared between the two, the more uncanny it looked. Perhaps it needs a little more defining. She hadn't done to the muscles or the flowing hair yet. The chair, seemingly understanding what she wanted to do, leaned down and sat her back up to the table. "Betty!" a distant voice bellowed behind the observer from up a hill. She knew the voice so well, she didn't even bother to look who it was. A young woman ran down the hill, holding onto her dress so as not to trip over her hemline, while her blonde-white hair, not much different than the creature's, flowed behind. As the young woman stopped next to the observer, a faint familiar smell of sharp perfume wafted over the observer's nose. It was definitely her. "Betty, are you done yet?" "Not yet, Paddy." Rather than looking at her, the observer continued on the portrait. The young lady leaned closer to get a glimpse. "You've been on that for hours, Betty." She then looked around, noticing a large pile of parchment where the table and chair once stood. "What number are you on?" The observer didn't reply. The young lady sighed. "It's time to come back." "Could you ask them for 30 more minutes?" the observer said, finally staring at the young lady. 30? The young lady reacted. "You've managed to get 35, now you want 30 more?" The observer nodded. "Well, you can't. The gathering starts soon. Come on, let's go." The observer sighed and leapt from the chair, and they both started up the hill. "Wait a second." The young lady pulled out a long black wooden rod from her sleeve and flicked it towards the pile of paper. They fluttered so elegantly against the prevailing wind, gathering around the young lady like a twister before landing in a neat pile on top of the table. The white creature neighed. "You know, I could have walked there and picked it up myself," the observer said. "I know," the lady beamed. The sun began its descent towards the west, turning the sky a brash orange. The two walked a wide white gravel forest path, heading for a small black wooden home at the end. The young lady strided meekly, occasionally glancing at the young girl next to her. "You think you've done it, Betty," she said, breaking the silence. The smaller of the two was much less reserved, walking stiffly while examining her work. She then twisted the leather-bound parchment at odd angles and oscillated it closer and farther to her face. "I think so, Paddy." The drawing on the parchment moved around, trotting elegantly just like its real-life counterpart. The girl squinted at the drawn horse. Something was off. It then lowered its head. "Its neck is too short," she groaned, suddenly feeling all her ambition burn away. "I'm never going to be an artist." Paddy chuckled. No one became a master of their craft on their first try. "But this is my 10th. "Betty, you just started learning this summer," Paddy reacted. "You've got your whole life ahead of you." She then reached out her hand. "May I see it?" Betty lent it to her, expressing disgust. Paddy examined it the same way Betty did, turning it at odd angles and placing it closer to her face. "I don't know, Betty. Your drawing looks pretty spot on. If I hadn't known you've drawn it, I thought it was a nomage photograph of Perfissiphus." "You're just saying that, Paddy. Why aren't you being honest?" "I am being honest." Paddy then examined it some more, now squinting. Well, I guess the neck is a bit short. It was the perspective. I couldn't get Persephus' neck up, so I used a baby horse as my reference, Betty said. Well, I stand by my word. A 12-year-old like you has a ton of time to improve, so don't be too harsh on yourself. Betty could never understand why Paddy acted with so much affection. This encouragement was so typical of her. Of course, Betty never complained. Her dad was the same way. Her younger sister acted the complete opposite, and she reciprocated the same feelings back at her. But Paddy was too friendly. The drawing creature then neighed while raising its 2 front legs before lowering its head, struggling to eat the grass Betty had drawn for it. Don't worry, I'll fix you. Reaching the end of the gravel path, they approached a black small farmhouse perched on a hill where its chimney puffed out dark clouds into the clear sky. Immediately to the left of the wooden home were several dozen black vehicles parked on a massive gravel patch. The two stepped up to the front balcony and through the front door. The interior, however, was completely far from the humble size from outside. A grand hall twice the size of the house dominated, while a large crystal chandelier hovered above magnificently. Below, embossed a giant crest of a knight on a horse equipped with a lance and red feather on top of its head. The insignia was covered by a wax layer, reflecting the amber lights from the windows and chandelier above. Paddy and Betty made their way across the main entrance into the wide open door which led to a concourse of similarly grand proportions. Light still left from the dwindling sun beamed through narrow windows in the hall. The sound of many children then echoed to their left. They turned to look. A dozen of them roamed, 2 on small brooms. As they passed, the first flying child nearly hit Paddy. "Watch it, Harkin," Paddy reacted. "Sorry, Paddy," a tall, skinny boy chasing the boy on the broom said while passing. "Paddy, watch out!" Another set of kids flew by. The second broom child collided into her, leaving them both a heap on the floor. "Paddy, you're all right?" Betty said, quickly coming to her aid. The child looked exactly like Paddy, a much smaller version of her. "Thorny, who told you could fly around the house?" The child immediately froze as she made eye contact with Paddy. The kids who chased the girl on the broom seemingly abandoned her, running from the scene. "We'll talk to Dad about this," Paddy said. The child stubbornly grabbed the broomstick and headed down the hall where the kids ran, stomping angrily. The 2 girls followed. "Why are you so annoying, Thorny?" Betty said. "Shut up," the child responded. "Thorny?" Paddy reacted. She then looked at Betty. "Don't provoke her." "Spoiled bugwot," Betty said under her breath. Crossing through 2 large doors at the end of the hall, a large ballroom welcomed them, complete with dark oak walls and large white granite pillars that reached the high ceilings. Echoes roared from the conversing families. The children Paddy and Betty just saw a second ago who caused trouble were all composed with their families. Thorny was the only one showing any sign of remorse. "Girls!" a man yelled from the crowd. He ran towards them. His white blonde hair, similar to that of Paddy's and Thorny's, stood well from the crowd, while a woman in brownish blonde slicked back hair followed him, expressing the same worry. "By Hamilton's fate, you've all made it, and together," the man said. "Let's go in then," the lady said to the 3 girls. As the echoes of the families diminished behind while they crossed the narrow, dark path of a hall not far from the one the girls went through, they approached yet another set of doors awaiting them. Candles perched on sconces surrounding the walls of the auditorium. The walls themselves were painted with many coloured flowers, white being most abundant. Contrasting the green foliage of the background, the ceiling carried golden branches coming out from its centre, spreading out like vines. More than a dozen rows of seating sloped down towards a large stage where 2 tall empty armchairs sat present on the platform. Behind the 2 armchairs, the same crest of horse and knight from the floor back in the entrance grand hall was placed proudly on the wall. The group walked 3 rows in and sat on the right set of a dozen seats, taking over the closest 5 from the farthest end. Just as they made themselves comfortable, Paddy then explained the situation with the broomstick and Thorny to her parents. They stared grimly at Paddy before looking at Thorny. "I'm sorry, Mum and Dad," Thorny whimpered. Both parents' faces were then filled with sympathy. "My dear Thorny, it's all right," the woman said. "Just don't do it again, all right?" The woman began wiping the tears off the young girl's face. Paddy, who examined the whole encounter, looked at Betty. "If it were so easy," Betty said, who looked frustrated by it all. "It's all right, I'm not hurt," Paddy said, "but she disobeyed Mum and Dad." "You nearly did so too if I hadn't picked you up." Betty glared at Paddy. Eventually the auditorium filled, bringing back the noise that came from the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, families of Grimes," a voice announced at the entrance of the auditorium. "We are pleased to announce the arrival of Elam and Benyota. Please stand up." The audience rose up from the chairs, all in sudden silence while looking back at the arch opening. Two people came through, a couple, a very, very old couple. The man's head was completely void of hair, replaced by a glossy pale surface mixed with patches of dark red. The woman wore a hat the size of 3 of her heads. Her face was covered by a thin black veil. The veil, however, didn't hide her age. She had many, many layers of skin, her eyes nearly gone from the large layer her eyelids made. Their approach down the slope was slow, an appropriate speed for their age. Then a sudden neighing muffled between Betty's feet. It was loud enough to cause a disturbance. "A horse here," she thought. Her heart skipped a beat. Ignoring the eyes looking at her, she took out an intricate pen from her dress pocket, grabbed the leather-bound parchment, and began erasing Persiphas's head. "Shut up! Shut up!" she whispered. As the couple made themselves comfortable on the 2 chairs on the stage, everyone then began sitting down in sequence with the first row, going towards the back. As Betty's row sat, she had completely cut Persiphas's head from body, but it now trotted, causing yet another disturbance. "Stop it!" She then erased away the hooves, which made it immediately collapse. Looking up, she saw how much attention she brought. There were a couple of concerned eyes from kids and a few adults in the rows below and above, but on her left, her 2 parents looked at her in disappointment, her mother's expression more severe. "Ladies and gentlemen, members of the great family Grimes." The old man's voice was thunderous and strong, completely opposite the way he looked. "I am deeply grateful for all your attendance to our countryside home. We hope you found your stay wonderful. As we start a new decade, let us reflect on what the past 10 years have given us. The souls we lost and gained, the experiences we've had, and the wealth grown." The old man continued with stories and accounts from family members those last 10 years. Betty heard many of them before. Her father shared them as they occurred throughout the decade, but they didn't sound that amusing anymore now that she was much older. He then went through finance, an excruciating, seemingly endless rant about finance. She was fully aware how important her family was in the finances of the wizarding world, but to assume that everyone in the family, let alone in the auditorium, was interested in the topic seemed odd to her. Betty quickly gazed around and saw a couple of closed eyes and heads leaning. Surely these people weren't interested. Thorny had completely fallen asleep. Betty herself began tipping from side to side, but the thought about the horse on her parchment completely woke her up. She gazed at the struggling Persiphas on the parchment, feeling guilty for taking major parts of his body from him. She didn't want to erase him all. She'd done good with this portrait. "Now leading us to this year. I have a strong feeling about this decade if I live long enough to see it." The audience laughed. "So I toast to a new decade, 10 years of more experiences, events and wealth. As we depart to our homes tomorrow, let us remember the eternal words of our great patriarch, Patrick Grimes. Prosper out, up and through time." Wine glasses then appeared and floated in mid-air, row by row in front of the auditorium attendees. Regular glass cups appeared for children. They all reached. "Prosper out, up and through time," all members in the auditorium said in unison with their cups in their hands. Then they indulged. Betty gazed left at Paddy's wine glass, wondering what the drink was. It couldn't be apple juice. "Betty, you know you're not old enough," Paddy said, noticing Betty's stare. After After what felt like half a day in the auditorium, the family sat at round tables spread around the ballroom. On the east end stood a long table with the older couple, Ellen and Benyota Grimes, in the middle, while older family members flanked them on both sides. With one clap from a caterer, food began apparating on the dinner plates around the room. The variation of food was immense. Lobsters and crab, pork slices, rice and beans, corn, cabbage, caviar, some plates even filled with a whole chicken. Betty's plate apparated a giant turkey leg with a side of peas and carrots and a large scoop of mashed potatoes drenched in gravy. Then a glass cup of more apple juice filled 3/4 up. Resenting the drink, Betty stared at Paddy's filled wine glass. Bubbles floated to the top of the faint yellow clear liquid, seemingly disappearing after a few seconds of contact. She could take a sip, just one. Paddy was occupied with her father, she wouldn't notice. "Betty!" her mum yelled. Betty's hand nearly grabbed hold, but Paddy immediately took the wine glass away. "The audacity of this young lady," her mum said, looking at their father. "We'll have a talk later. I want you to sit between us," her mother demanded. "Mom, I won't do it again." "Betty, now!" Betty, feeling defeated, grabbed her dinner and left her chair. Paddy moved to Betty's old spot. Her father sat in Paddy's and Betty her father's. "You were nearly late for meeting, you disrespect Ellen and Benyota with your silly drawing, and you try to drink Paddy's champagne?" Her mother stared at Paddy for confirmation, but Paddy looked away. "We can't move on like this, we won't," her mum said. Betty completely focused on her dinner, trying to chew the turkey she stuffed in her mouth. Her mother sighed and went for her own dinner. Laughter and smiles beamed from all the tables as the small orchestra played in the background. Children were still on their best behaviour as expected. The only Grimes table not enjoying themselves was Betty's. Paddy briefly glanced around the four at the table. There was complete silence between them all. Her eyes then met Betty's, who looked troubled. Their mother would occasionally look up as well, though forbidding. Betty felt she was more of a hostage than a guest of that night's dinner. As nightfall came, tables started emptying and caterers began cleaning up after the families, who now said their goodbyes before separating into their respective quarters. Children ran for the doors that flanked the hallway. With no adults to satisfy, they returned back into their loud and destructive selves they were so good at hiding. Betty was finally free from her mother's grasp. She checked her watch. She had 45 minutes before the stables completely shut down for the night. Maybe she could convince a staff member to see the real Perphicephus. She couldn't leave her portrait of him without head and hooves. With the leather-bound drawing in her arms, Betty walked through the main entrance hall and out the front door. The night breeze was refreshing after too many hours of stuffy, perfumed air. Just as she placed one foot on the dry soil off the balcony, the door creaked. A second later, a flood of yellow glowed towards the night. "What are you doing, Betty?" a voice said. Betty froze. A chill ran down her spine, immediately recognizing that voice. She then turned to see her terrifying mother staring back at her. Her mind began racing through the many excuses she had available, filtering the ones that were not convincing enough. "I left the table and chair out," she chose. "The ranch staff took care of that already," her mum said. "Oh." "They locked the doors in 5 minutes. If you didn't come back before then, were you willing to sleep outside? I doubt the family would trust you with keys to the home." "I would sleep here if I was locked outside," Betty pointed to a wooden bench on the edge of the balcony. "You would?" Her mother stared at the bench. "If you plan to, I'd be impressed if you make it through the whole night." Betty kept her mouth shut. "Come on, Betty, I don't have time for this." Past the grand entrance and right at the concourse, the two made their way quite quickly down the hall, while Betty's mother held her shoulders as they moved. They passed parents old and young, hugging their children goodbye before their quarter doors closed. Reaching Betty's quarters, her mother turned her around. She then bent down at eye level while gripping her shoulders, staring just as severe as when she saw her outside. "I won't do that. That's enough, Betty," she interrupted. "I thought that brief talk at dinner would put you proper. I guess I was wrong." "I'm sorry. If you do anything severely out of line for the rest of summer, I'll personally request that Thermadore won't allow you to use magic the whole year." Betty gasped. "But how do I do school without magic?" "I wouldn't want to figure that out myself too. Behave and good night." The door behind Betty then creaked open, and she was gently pushed across by her mum's spell. Betty attempted to open her mouth to say goodnight back, but the door then slammed shut. All she wanted to do was give Perphicephus his body parts back. Betty was sure her mother would understand that. She kept the portrait of him underneath her stuff in her suitcase, done with seeing him. Lying on her bed, she stared at the wall in front. Her mum was willing to revoke her rights to magic for the whole school year. She knew she would have behaved better, they were only here a week, but she couldn't handle being around the whole family. They were self-important, perfectionists, who didn't care about anything else that didn't help the family prosper, in their own words. She never felt inspired as her father promised her she'd be before the trip. For her, they all felt fake. It was obvious from their obnoxious hugs in the hall and those smiles at dinner. Betty hated fake people, so she hated it here. Just as her eyes were about to shut for the night, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She quickly rotated herself on her bed. A slightly larger dark-haired girl stared down at her. Betty sighed. "What do you want, Burley?" "Someone to play beast and hunt with." Betty adjusted herself to see Burley upright. "Don't you see I'm trying to sleep? But you're not wearing earmuffs." Betty quickly glanced around the several bunk beds that laid around the room. Indeed, for those occupied bunks, she could see the fuzzy dark ear covers attached to their heads. Betty sighed. "But I don't want to play, Burley. Why don't you go to bed like the others?" The girl's face turned to gloom. Betty stared past her, to avoid seeing the grim face. She then noticed the large group of girls with Thorny near the fireplace, playing beast and hunt under dimming charcoal. "Why don't you girls go to bed? It's nearly midnight," Betty yelled. The girls all stopped and stared at her. "We'll be in bed soon, Betty. Why won't you play with Burley?" a red-headed girl across her sister yelled. Betty laid her head back on her pillow, on the bed, staring at the girls. "'Cause it's late." The red-headed girl scoffed. The girls then continued on their game. "Just go to bed," Betty said to Burley, who stared at both Betty and the girl. "You're no fun, Betty," she said before heading towards a bunk bed across the room. Betty then turned herself back to face the wall. Tomorrow she'd be out of here, out of the state, and back home. Maybe she could convince her father to head to a local stable on their way there and fix Perphicephus.